The most pressing issue in my mind is economic growth. And the primary reason for that is that the major consideration for all people, and particularly for the poor, is to raise the poor out of poverty. There's almost no doubt from an empirical point of view that if we look at the world, and particularly the modern world, the poor are helped most in those economies that have grown the most rapidly. So the most obvious example in recent decades is China, India, and Vietnam more recently. But if you look at China, for example, and you compare China to where it was in the early 80s, I was in China in the early 80s, it was poverty, universal poverty, no cars, no development. People were literally living on one meal a day. And now 500 million people have moved into the middle class. So there's still tremendous, not still, actually increasing inequality in China, without a doubt. But if we look at the state of living, standard of living of the poor, there's no question that the performance has been just spectacular by any standards in what's happened over the past couple of decades. Again, the same true in India to a somewhat lesser extent, but the same is true there and starting to become true in places like Vietnam. Well, the global solution depends on the level of development. So for the most developed countries, the message is pretty standard. While we don't know how to fix things necessarily in the short run, we know the formula that seems to work in the long run. And the formula for long-term economic growth tends to be a fair and reasonable tax structure, budgetary discipline, lots of international trade, and sensible regulation. Those seem to be the ingredients to sustained growth for developed countries. For the less developed countries, again, I would go back to looking at the most recent examples, the Asian tigers, and more recently China, India, and Vietnam. And there, the solution has been to adopt a more market economy. If you look at those countries, every one of them has moved away from very strong government control to allowing the market to operate in a much freer way, and that's had a tremendous effect on growth. It's certainly going to be relevant. The question with the summit, and I've been associated with the GES for a long time now, is how we interact, not during the meeting, but in between the meetings. And does the energy that we see at a gathering like this maintain its level throughout the year? Because in order to get things to happen, it's not sufficient to simply talk about something for 2 days and then let it go. It has to be sustained effort.